Okay, welcome everybody. My name is Rob Blair. I'm a professor in the Department of Political Science and the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs at Brown University. And I'm also the coordinator of the Democratic Erosion Consortium. I'm here with Gretchen Helmke from the University of Rochester and Brightline Watch, and we will be co-moderating this virtual roundtable on voting and electoral manipulation. This topic could not be more timely, and we are just delighted that so many of you could join us. So the roundtable was organized as part of the Democratic Erosion Consortium, which is a network of over 50 universities in the US, UK, Ireland, Israel, Turkey, Romania, South Korea, Australia, and the Philippines. And as a consortium, our goal is to combine teaching and research and civic and policy engagement to help our students and faculty better understand threats to democracy, both in the US and also abroad, and better address those threats through our work as students and educators and citizens. And our members run the gamut from small private liberal arts colleges to large public research universities. One of the centerpieces of the consortium is a course on democratic erosion that is taught at dozens of campuses every semester. And I know many of you in the audience today are either teaching or taking that course this fall. So a special welcome to all of you. Our faculty also use the consortium as a vehicle for producing research, for example, an ongoing project that is testing strategies for reducing partisan polarization among American youths. We also use the consortium as a mechanism for engaging the policy community, including USAID, the State Department, the National Democratic Institute, a variety of other organizations. We have a lot of exciting activities and events planned for this academic year. So if you are an educator and are interested in joining the consortium, I hope you will please email me or visit our website, democratic-erosion.com. And I also just want to let you know that we're going to be hosting a second virtual roundtable on Friday, November 13th. And that roundtable is going to focus on the results of the upcoming US elections. It's going to be held from 1 to 2:30 p.m. Eastern, and we'll be circulating posters and flyers and all that well in advance of the event. But I just want you to mark your calendars for November 13th if you are interested in that event. Okay, so now I'm going to turn the virtual mic over to Gretchen, who will introduce our panelists and get us kicked off.
Great, thank you so much, Rob. I just want to welcome everybody. I'm Gretchen Helmke. I'm a professor of political science at the University of Rochester, and I'm currently teaching a course on democratic erosion. I'm also one of the co-founders of Brightline Watch, along with Sue Stokes, who's with us today, and John Carey and Brendan Nyhan at Dartmouth College. We formed Brightline Watch a couple of years ago in order to analyze the health of American democracy and also to help organize events like this one that bring leading scholars, students, and the public together to discuss the challenges and threats to our democracy. So we are really delighted and honored today to have such a distinguished panel of political scientists and legal experts from universities across the country. With Election Day now less than 40 days away, we thought it would be an excellent time to give students a chance to hear directly from these experts, many of whom are already on their syllabi that they're reading this semester, but also give them a chance to ask some of these scholars questions they might have about the election. Now, little did we know when we put this panel together a few weeks ago that this week's headlines would be filled with our president repeatedly raising doubts about whether he would concede the election in the event that he loses. Now, obviously, free and fair elections in which a losing candidate accepts defeat and peacefully transitions out of office are the very foundation of our democracy. So I cannot think of a better time to hear from scholars who have long been voicing concerns about the trajectory of democracy in the United States, and particularly about some of the challenges that the 2020 election might pose for our system of government. So without further delay, let me introduce our panelists, and I'm going to go in alphabetical order. So Professor Richard L. Hasen is Chancellor's Professor of Law and Political Science at the University of California at Irvine. He is a nationally recognized expert in election law and campaign finance, as well as areas of legislation and statutory interpretation. You've probably seen him several times on TV this week already. He also runs the election law blog, and his most recent book is entitled Election Meltdown: Dirty Tricks, Distrust, and the Threat to American Democracy. So welcome, Professor Hasen. We're very excited to have you here. Professor Susan Hyde is a professor of political science at the University of California at Berkeley and the Avice, I'm not sure if I'm saying that correctly, M. Saint Chair in Public Policy. She is an expert on international election observation, election fraud, and democracy promotion. She's done research on election observation and has served on missions with organizations in Afghanistan, Albania, Venezuela, and many other places. Her work has been foundational in understanding comparative electoral systems, and her book, The Pseudo-Democrat's Dilemma: Why Election Observation Became an International Award, has become an international norm, has won numerous awards. Jennifer McCoy is professor of political science at Georgia State University. Dr. McCoy also served as director of the Carter Center's Americas program between 1998 and 2015, where she led over a dozen international election observation missions to Latin America. She is an expert on international election observation and election integrity, democratic norms, and also Venezuelan politics. And her current research focuses on political polarization and democratic erosion around the world. Her most recent book is entitled Polarizing Polities: A Global Threat to Democracy. And our final panelist is Susan Stokes, who is the Tiffany and Margaret Blake Distinguished Service Professor of Political Science and Director of the Program on Democracy at the University of Chicago. She was previously chair of the Yale Political Science Department, and she is also, as I mentioned, one of the co-founders of Brightline Watch. She has published numerous award-winning books and articles about democratization, democratic accountability, and economic reforms, as well as studied social movements and police responses in new democracies. Her most recent book is entitled Why Bother? Rethinking Participation in Elections and Protests. So what we're planning to do today is we've asked each of the panelists to prepare about 10 minutes of remarks where they address questions directly relevant to the upcoming election. Specifically, we've asked them to consider what are the most important political threats to voting rights and equal representation in American politics today? Why are we seeing such intense partisan fighting over voting rights now? How is the coronavirus exacerbating these institutional battles? And how do the dynamics of the upcoming US elections compare both to past presidential elections in the United States and also to other elections around the world? So I'm going to turn it over to Professor Hasen to start us off.
Thanks so much. It's great to be with all of you across the country. Sorry we can't all be together in person, but this is a pretty good substitute for that. So I appreciate it. In my book, Election Meltdown, I explain the 4 reasons why I think we're seeing a deteriorating trust in American democracy and in the legitimacy of American elections. That book came out in February, just before we had COVID become a major issue in the United States, as well as protests over racial injustice and the reaction of the president to all of that. So let me talk for a couple of minutes about the themes in the book as to why I see American confidence in elections eroding, and then talk about, since the book's come out, why things have gotten worse, leading to the culmination this week of the president's comments about not accepting an election result potentially, and not agreeing to a peaceful transition of power. I mean, there's pretty dramatic moments this week. And just before we got on, the New York Times posted a story about Pentagon officials being worried about being dragged into the election, which is not a headline I think we would have expected to see. So the 4 reasons that I outline in Election Meltdown for why I think we've seen this deterioration in trust in American elections are first, voter suppression. So what we've seen is the Republican Party adopting a strategy where they believe they will do better electorally with a smaller electorate, a wider, older, more rural electorate, and that passing laws that make it harder for people to register and vote and claiming that Democrats are engaged in voter fraud is serving political purposes to both shrink turnout and create greater distrust of Democratic victories. Not all of these attempts at trying to make it harder to vote actually have a large effect on turnout. The social science evidence is mixed, for example, on whether voter ID laws actually depress turnout, but they do send a message to both sides that the other party is cheating. In addition, we've seen a kind of ratcheting up of the means used to try to make it harder to register and vote. This has become especially true, if I could jump ahead a bit, in the time of the coronavirus. So we've seen Republicans line up for the most part in lawsuits, and we now have about 250 COVID-related election lawsuits in the country. We've seen Republicans line up against rules that have made it easier for people to vote by mail during the pandemic. And so this, this kind of churn about voter fraud and voter suppression teaches both sides that the other side is trying to cheat. The second factor, which I talk about in the book, are pockets of weak election administration. So just to take an example from yesterday, the FBI, or the Department of Justice, released a press release, and then a second press release, and then a letter where it was first claimed that there was ballots for Donald Trump thrown in the trash in a Pennsylvania, from a Pennsylvania election office. What seems to have happened is that some military voters voted by mail. The ballots came in regular envelopes that appeared that they were requesting an absentee ballot. There was a request to get an absentee ballot as opposed to the ballots themselves. Looks like administrative error, but yet President Trump, according to reporting this morning at ABC News, was briefed by Attorney General Barr about this before this announcement. He claimed widespread voter fraud. And then not only did the press release say that they were doing this investigation, in the middle of the investigation, they announce it, which is quite unusual. In the middle of an election, it's quite unusual. It also said that all the votes were for Donald Trump, which is something that is legally irrelevant and never would have been included. So what you see here is that we have pockets of election administrator incompetence. It was incompetent how it seems how these ballots were handled, but it gets turned around into a fraud allegation. And so that further undermines confidence. The third thing we've seen in our elections that has undermined confidence is dirty tricks. We can think of what the Russians did in 2016, the hacking and leaking of emails that were politically embarrassing, attempt to foment social unrest and to suppress voting, especially among African-American voters, by posing as Black activists as opposed to being people in Russia trying to influence the US election. And also the probing of election voter registration databases run by election administrators across the country in the United States. Those kinds of things, even if they're not successful at changing votes, and there's no indication that they are, further undermine confidence. And the last and the fourth factor, and the one that really brings to mind the comments of Trump this week, is an increasingly incendiary rhetoric around rigged or stolen elections. The president has long made these remarks. There was one study going back to 2012 showing he's made over 100 such remarks, claiming that elections are stolen or rigged. He even claimed in the election he won in 2016 that there were 3 to 5 million votes, more than the popular vote difference between himself and Hillary Clinton, that were stolen and that were voted by non-citizens, all for his opponent. A completely unsubstantiated, ridiculous charge. He's continued making these charges, claiming that there's widespread voter fraud in the use of mail-in ballots. And he has said, and this is probably as concerning to me as the statements about, we'll see about the peaceful transition of power. He said that if he does not win the election, it means that it's rigged. Now, the more benign, although not benign, explanation for these comments is that what he's trying to do is to come up with an excuse. If he loses the election, he could say, well, I didn't really lose, the election was stolen from me, and he's going to leave power if he loses. But there are less benign explanations, including there's an explosive story in the Atlantic this week about possibly using some extraordinary legal measures, and we can get into this in the Q&A if there are questions, about trying to take the vote away from some American voters to vote for president and having state legislatures try and do it directly. Really some norm-breaking types of things, even if they might be technically legally available. Just showing that, especially when it comes to our presidential elections, so much of how we conduct them is governed by norms rather than governed by strict laws about how we conduct our elections. And the fact is the United States Constitution today does not provide voters with a direct ability to vote for the presidents of the United States. So this rhetoric is ratcheting things up when the president says that we'll see about a peaceful transition of power. That's not the kind of statement we ever would have expected. If you think back to Jimmy Carter or George H.W. Bush, both one-term presidents, there was never any question, would they leave office? When they lost, they graciously congratulated their opponents, and they just agreed to fight another day after a hard-fought but fair election. And so we're in a crisis, I think, in terms of election legitimacy. And I'll just end that, since I only have a couple of minutes left, by saying how COVID has made all of this so much worse. So ordinarily, it's not good for election administrators to roll out new rules in the midst of a presidential election. Just like you wouldn't premiere your brand new play straight to Broadway, you'd want to have some smaller venues, perfect everything. That's normally how election administrators think about changing rules. But here now, because of the pandemic, we're seeing states make a lot of changes in voting rules. They have to consolidate polling places because places aren't available, poll workers aren't available. There's much more mail-in balloting, which not every state is set up to handle quickly. And whenever there's this kind of change, there are mistakes that are made, and there's a learning curve. And that just becomes really dangerous when any kind of mistake, as we saw in the example from Luzerne County, Pennsylvania yesterday, any kind of mistake is seized on by political operatives as evidence of fraud. And I think it's a very volatile situation, made even more volatile by the fact that Republicans blocked adequate election funding for this election. We know it's going to be more expensive to run both in-person and mail-in balloting during a pandemic. Those costs are still going to be there, but it means we're going to have under-resourced election administration. That means people are more likely to make mistakes, and that creates the kind of conditions where we could be in some trouble, because whenever there's a problem in how an election is run, even if it's done with the best of motives, if there's a political reason, we've at least seen the president and his allies seize on it as evidence that there's actually fraud in the election. So let me stop there. I'm sure there'll be lots of things to talk about after we hear from the other presenters.
Great, thank you so much. Professor Hyde, do you want to continue?
Yes, great. Gretchen and Rob, thank you so much for organizing this. I just want to say hello to the students of mine who are here from my Elections Around the World class, and also Sue, Jennifer, and Rick. It's an honor to be here with you today. I suppose I should be calling you all Professor, but many old friends here, so it's nice to see you virtually, if not in person. Today, I think I'm going to speak most exclusively about information. So one of the central problems that I've been thinking about relates to documented election manipulation versus assumed election manipulation. The general model that I've been thinking about, or that I have in mind in responding to the questions that we were sent in advance of this panel, is one in which you should pay attention to three things. First is the true quality of the election, the thing that we would be able to tell if we had access to all of the information we would need to make that judgment. The second thing is the outcome of the election, who won, who lost, and how that was perhaps influenced by the quality of the election. The third thing I think we want to think about as a sort of general model of elections when we're talking about some of the problems that are coming up on the panel today are voter reactions to the outcome, which can be influenced by both the outcome of the election and the quality of the election. The reason why I want to focus on information is that when we were asked to think about some of the most important threats to voting rights and equal representation in American politics today, as well as how the dynamics of the upcoming US presidential elections compared to past American elections and other elections around the world, the thing that most immediately jumps to my mind is that this is an election in which I think the informational environment and the media environment has changed such that I'm quite worried that there's no single source or no set of sources that voters across the political spectrum can turn to for objective information that they themselves are likely to trust. Not that they shouldn't trust, that's not the question I'm asking, but they are likely to trust for objective information about especially the quality of the election, but also the outcome of the election and what other voters and how other voters are reacting. So if we take a step back and think about the ideal model of democracy under some kind of threat, one of the memes that's out there has to do with the notion of self-enforcing democracy, which those of you in the classes may have already been paying a good deal of attention to in some of the readings that you're doing perhaps. But the general idea underlying self-enforcing democracy is that politicians might always like to win. They might always like to do what it takes to win an election. They might even always be willing to cheat a little bit in order to ensure that they get the outcome that they want. But in many cases, they don't. And so the question is, why don't they always cheat? And one of the theories that I like, that I think helps me deal with a lot of other questions, is this idea that many politicians don't manipulate elections because they're worried about what would happen if they're caught. And one of the things that we think enforces democracy, that makes leaders worry about what would happen if they were caught, is that they worry about citizens reacting very negatively to credible accusations or credible reports of election manipulation. So many leaders around the world don't steal elections because they think that the consequences of trying to do that would be predictably severe. That relies on some reaction by voters, but it also relies on voters having access to information that is potentially an objective source of information about whether the elections were actually stolen. One of the things that I've noticed about a lot of elections around the world is that lots of losers of elections think they should have won the day after the election and the hours after the election results. Most people who run for office most of the time think that they have a shot at winning, and they're very disappointed when they lose, and they often have to be persuaded that they lost because they didn't get enough votes, right? That's usually an act of persuasion, sometimes facilitated by access to objective information about the quality of elections. But again, many losers of elections have to be persuaded, as well as their supporters. So historically and globally, we know that incumbents do usually win elections. This can be because they do a good job in office. It can also be because they abuse state resources to stay in power. Sometimes it's a little bit difficult to tell the difference between them, but in democracies, we want citizens to be able to vote out leaders who are not performing well in office. That's something that we think is core to democracy. The problem is it's sometimes difficult for citizens to tell the difference. So again, if we have a case in which the opposition wins an election, there is objective information about the election quality, power is transferred peacefully from the incumbent party or politicians to the new parties or leaders in power, many sins related to election quality are forgiven. Right? We can see around the world, there's been some questionable elections, but if the opposition wins, a lot of times people are willing to move forward. Why? Because it's quite rare that only the opposition cheats and that they're able to do so independently. The incumbent does not also cheat, and they do so enough to tip the balance in their favor. That just hasn't happened very many times in the world, as far as we know. What I'm worried about right now and what I'm thinking about right now is that if voters assume or infer the quality of the election, rather than rely on some kind of objective source for information about the quality of the election, it can have all kinds of perverse consequences, and it can be an equilibrium that's very hard to get out of. So as Professor Hasen mentioned, it is entirely possible that reports about or concerns about poor election quality are demobilizing to some voters, right? That they become very fatalistic. They think the process will be stolen no matter what. And as a result, they don't come out and turn out on election day. Assuming the quality of elections can also lead to something like what we might call sore loser protests or post-election reactions, in which voters use the shortcut of the outcome of the election to infer the quality of the process. And it's that informational thing that I'm very interested in, right? This should be avoided if we can. We should have an objective source of information about the quality of the process, separate from an inference about the quality of the process that is based on who won. I personally think that's important for democracy's functioning. It's also possible that concerns about the quality of the process can mobilize voters. That's entirely possible. That happens some of the time. But the thing that continues to concern me is the siloing of sources of information that voters are turning to about elections, and the concern that if we get into any one of these many worst case scenarios that people have been coming up with in the immediate post-election environment, we may be in a situation where we have a more difficult time getting out of that equilibrium because we're unable to communicate to voters across the political spectrum. And I say we very, very generally, right? There's going to be no trusted source that everyone's going to be listening to, which I think is a problem. So how can we fix it? I think it should be a solvable problem. There are some exciting developments. Jennifer, I don't know if you're going to be talking about the work that the Carter Center is doing on this front. There will be international observers from the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe to respond to one of the questions that we got from students in advance. They've been coming to US elections since 2002. And I have to say, it's still the #1 question I get. Shouldn't we have international observers in the US? Well, we have had them for a while. And still no one is turning to them as really widely known resources for information on election quality. Maybe this will be the election in which that's different. There's also something called it's a bipartisan, it's called a group called the National Task Force on Election Crises, which is got a lot of really high profile people on it. It's doing really interesting work. But I remain a little bit concerned that citizens will assume election manipulation or the lack of election manipulation rather than seeking out a credible source. We do know a lot about election manipulation, how to detect it, how it can be concealed or excused, and the degree to which it is likely to influence the outcome of the elections. Those are questions that are answerable to different degrees. But I think it's a dangerous and potentially brittle equilibrium for voters and citizens to become very fatalistic about the quality of the process, to assume that it's going to be bad. Again, that can be demobilizing for certain groups of certain classes of voters, or assume that election manipulation will occur. I'm not at all saying that voters shouldn't protest if the process ends up being manipulated. That is an important part of at least some theories about how democracy is supposed to work and be defended if it is threatened. So post-election protests following election manipulation is something that I think is sometimes critical for the maintenance of democracy in many countries around the world. But it doesn't work unless it's really about election manipulation and it's not about who won. So I'll stop there. I think I'm somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 minutes. Thank you, everyone.
Great, thank you so much. Professor McCoy?
Yeah, thank you all. Great to be here. I wanted to ask and answer 3 questions. How and why are voting rights and equal representation at risk today in the US, which is the first question for the seminar? How does the US compare to other countries? And what can we do about the risks? So I want to build on what we've already heard because I agree with everything I've heard so far. But I want to talk about the risks that are posed to our elections and to our country today of extreme political polarization. And what I mean by that is that the country is divided into us versus them tribes. And those people who identify most closely with each side, Democrats or Republicans, now tend to see the other as an existential threat to the nation or the way of life. In fact, in 1994, a poll by the Pew Research Center said that only 16% of Americans answered saying the other political party was a threat to the nation. By 2016, that had increased to 44% of Democrats and 47% of Republicans answering that the other party was a threat to the nation. So this level of polarization, of divide, and the perceived threat raises the stakes of elections. And especially given the way that we elect our representatives in this country with single member districts for legislatures. And since we have no direct presidential election, but we elect electors to the Electoral College, the presidential winner in most states gets all of the Electoral College votes. So that creates a sense of winner take all and means the losers don't feel represented. So when we have this context of high distrust, this creates a lot of suspicion about the intentions of the other side and some of the things that Professors Hyde and Hasen were talking about. So my comparative research of polarized countries around the world shows that when a group or a leader comes to power and fears losing that power eventually, which most do, they'll do everything possible to change the rules or create an unlevel playing field so they will continue to win. And that's what leads in this context of high division, of high polarization, to democratic erosion that we're studying this semester. In my own state of Georgia, an example is when the Democrats were on the wane. They had been dominating state politics for decades in Georgia, as in much of the Deep South. And when they were on the wane in power in 1980s and 90s, as Republicans were beginning to grow in the state, Democrats gerrymandered districts trying to stay in power. But by the early 2000s, Republicans were grew to dominate the entire state government, all the branches. And today, polarization is much stronger. So if we look nationwide, the party in power today in the presidency and one branch of Congress and in the majority of states fears losing if voting is expanded. They've actually said that. President Trump actually said that Republicans can't win if everyone votes. So the fear of losing. And that will lead people who believe that if the other side comes to power, there'll be a threat to the nation. That will lead people to go to extreme lengths to prevent that from happening. So as Professor Hasen talked about, I see a very significant threat from President Trump's comments this week that he is deliberately sowing distrust in the process. And I've seen this in countries where I've monitored elections abroad as well. Particularly if a leader feels like they can't win with their own majority by attracting enough people to support them, they will try instead to win by dissuading opposition voters from participating. So President Trump sowing distrust, talking about fraud, illegal votes back in the 2016 elections, as was mentioned, without any evidence, continuing to talk today about the mail-in ballots aren't to be trusted. He's raising questions in the minds of many of his own supporters that if after the election, and we'll probably have a long drawn out count because of COVID and high use of absentee voting, if the trend goes against him and if he loses, then the risk is his own supporters will believe the election has been stolen and that Joe Biden will become president, but an illegitimate president in the eyes of a large sector of the population. So this is this information that Professor Hyde was talking about. And what do we assume? Now, if Trump wins after sowing distrust in the process, many on the Democratic side will believe that he won only by trickery, by encouraging local Republican officials to reject a lot of mail-in ballots or otherwise disenfranchising many people, using some of the voter suppression tactics that Professor Hasen talked about. So no matter what, the new government loses legitimacy. So how does this compare to other countries? Well, the US is very unusual. We do not have a central election authority to make the decisions, to run the elections, to have consistency across the country, and to announce the results. We are extremely decentralized, and it goes down to the state level and then the individual county level. We also don't have a universal ID card. Most other countries do. And so that means that states decide by themselves what kind of ID is going to be required. And that leads to a lot of controversy, which we could get to in the Q&A about the ID cards. So that means that voting conditions are inconsistent across the country for different voters, and it increases the potential for lawsuits and disputed results in these elections in particular. We also are somewhat unusual in having counter-majoritarian institutions. Now, these were things put in place by the founders of our country to protect states' rights. And this was in a very different era, trying to protect states' rights because it was a country bringing together different states, trying to create one unified whole. So they had to respect states' rights greatly. Today, we're much more of a unified country, but we still have those early mechanisms that I view as antiquated today, especially the Electoral College. We also have the Senate, which is meant to give equal representation to every state, but it means there's each vote is very, very unequal. So, for example, the Senate, we always had about 30% of the population getting 70% of senators, because even the small, less populous states get 2 senators, just like the very large populous states, California, New York. So today, what's different about that is that because of the polarization and the way our parties have sorted into an urban-rural partisan divide, where Republicans are stronger in the rural areas than the smaller states, and Democrats in the larger urban areas and more populous states. That advantage in the Senate is a structural advantage that goes to the Republicans and gives them disproportionate representation and leads to Democratic frustration. So what should we do? Well, I think what Professor Hyde said was extremely important about the information and how we assess what happens leading up to election day, and especially in the days after. We need to recognize the difference between fraud and irregularities. Fraud is the intentional effort to manipulate voting to systematically advantage one party or candidate or disadvantage another. Okay, so fraud is systematic in favor of one side or the other. Irregularities are unintended errors. They might be errors by the voters or by the voting officials or sheer incompetence, but it has a random effect. It's not hurting any specific party or candidate. So we need to look for the difference and don't assume fraud. Second, we need to make a plan for voting. And especially if your state's not accustomed to ballot by mail, voting by mail, consider voting early. In Georgia, for example, we had huge problems in 2018 and the June primaries this year. Thousands of ballots were thrown out because we had very strict requirements about an exact match for the way your name was spelled, whether you put your middle initial in or not, or because your signature didn't match maybe a voter registration card that you'd signed 20 years ago. So I would say if you want to vote by mail or need to for health reasons or because you're out of town, then request a ballot now, return it early, track it on the Secretary of State website that most states have, see if it's been received, and then if it's challenged, you'll have time to go and fix it or cure it, as they say, or to decide to go vote in person. But you have to do everything early because this is going to be a massive turnout election and new rules with COVID, and we want to make sure that things go as smoothly as possible. Thank you.
Terrific, thanks. Professor Stokes?
Oh, thanks so much, and hi, everybody. So I looked at the lineup of this panel, and I knew that we were going to go in alphabetical order, so I knew that my fellow panelists were going to have completely taken care of the questions that we, done and dusted on those questions. So I'm going to step back and say a few more general things about where we are and you know, a little bit about maybe how we got here and what can be done. So so I'm just going to describe some events. Mobs supporting the incumbent president swarm polling places, intimidating voters. The government delays elections under pretense of security concerns. Large numbers of voters are turned away at the polls, not allowed to vote. Officials use public funds to promote themselves by transforming government events into campaign rallies. New electoral systems are introduced requiring identity cards to vote. 4 million voters from a state are excluded from voter registration lists. After a president loses an election, a high court with a majority of his appointees nullifies the votes of several million voters, giving the incumbent the election. So these attacks on elections took place in countries that are wonderful countries, but they're not countries that we want to be in a same category with in terms of the quality of our democratic governance. The mobs at polling places were in Venezuela in 2018, could have been Fairfax County, Virginia last week. Last month, President Trump suggested delaying the November elections. Elections were delayed in Lebanon and the Philippines in 2017. The case of officials using public funds to turn government events into campaign rallies took place in Turkey in 2014. But it could have described Secretary of State Mike Pompeo giving a speech to the Republican National Convention last month while on official business in Israel. Millions of voters were excluded from registration lists in the state of Assam, India in 2018, just like they're being excluded today in Florida. And a high court with a majority of appointees of the incumbent president nullifying an election that he lost, that event took place in the Ivory Coast in 2010. But it's being projected by President Trump when he says, I think the election will end up in the Supreme Court, and I think it's important that we have 9 justices. So how did we get here? There are all kinds of prior factors, and those of you who are studying the democratic erosion course will be reading articles and books that give some explanations. There are all kinds of prior factors that encourage democratic erosion. Just a few important examples: the rise of income inequality and decline in class mobility in many Western countries and elsewhere, the hollowing out of many social functions of government that would give it legitimacy in the eyes of many citizens. But as crucial as it is to address these overall factors, and they certainly have to be addressed, they have been in place in the United States for years, without our democracy taking on features of politics that make us look like Venezuela, Turkey, or the Ivory Coast. It's deeply unsettling, I think, and I think I probably a view that is shared by the panelists, deeply unsettling to see how fragile a thread it is on which our democracy has hung. I put forth that 2 things, only 2 things have been required to place our democracy in grave danger, and I think it is in grave danger. One is a president coming to office who wants to be an autocrat. And the second is a president who is adept at turning himself into a cult leader, meaning that he's talented at turning his base into people who are insensitive to information, going back to Susan Hyde's points, insensitive to information or messaging from outside sources, that adept at frequently using the same kind of language, linguistic cues, hoax, witch hunt, fake news, and so forth, that tend to blunt his followers' abilities to sort of think through problems. By the way, I blame that on the leader, not on the followers. Everything else I put forth, everything else that we're seeing follows from these 2 facts, from an aspiring autocratic leader who is adept at building a cult. The politicization of the civil service, the enabling by fellow party leaders, their failure to break with the president when he violates deeply important norms of democratic governance, the exacerbating of polarization, of political polarization, which other speakers have mentioned, the politicization of the Justice Department, pressure in that direction on the armed forces in the United States, further politicization and loss of competence in the federal bench, attacks on the press, political violence around protests, including killings in protests, and on, and all it took for these things to happen was a president who wanted to be an autocrat and a president who has turned himself into a cult leader. Now, you might well say, and those of you who are students in democratic erosion courses will have learned something about this, that we needed a prior political polarization for this to happen, and that polarization predates Trump. So that's true, but it's also the case that his nurturing of his following as a cult would have helped further increase polarization, even if it had not been accelerating for 2 decades. You might have read an excellent book, How Democracies Die, and other pieces on the course syllabus that talk about the importance of kind of loyal democratic allies of would-be autocrats who break with the allies and with the autocrat, and therefore put a brake on democratic erosion. So we have observed many, many times kind of the failure of the Republican Party leadership to break with this would-be autocrat. But notice that the cult following that Trump has nurtured means that to defect from the president would be to commit political suicide and career suicide. And what about another ingredient that we should think about, and we should think hard about how widespread this is in our democracy. And I'm mindful of Professor McCoy's mentioning of gerrymandering by Democrats in the South. Maybe are both parties insufficiently committed to democracy, or do we have a kind of unequal lack of commitment to democracy? So here's a mental exercise. Could this have happened with a Democratic president who wanted to be an autocrat and who was adept at turning himself into a cult leader? Would we be in the same situation today? I don't know the answer to that question. So what can we do? Well, there are some longer term kind of goals that I think and tasks that are on the agenda. We will need some basic legal reforms that rein in the kind of constitutional hardball that we've been observing. And the House of Representatives recently unveiled what they're calling the Protecting Our Democracy Act. And I think it's a good start, actually, as a kind of laundry list of reforms that, that we now understand we need, that we didn't know that we needed before. I'll just mention a few of them. Pardon reform. So there's more transparency when presidents pardon people. And the recognition that pardons are things of value and therefore can be used as bribes. Suspension of the statute of limitation for federal offenses committed by the president and the vice president. Enforcement of domestic and foreign emoluments clauses. Enforcement of congressional subpoenas with fines. Measures that make it harder for congressional funding choices to be undermined by the executive branch. Congressional oversight over presidential emergency declarations. Tightening controls and transparency of the Justice Department to reduce political interference in prosecutions, federal prosecutions. Protection of inspectors generals so that, for example, they can only be fired with cause. Further protection of whistleblowers. Strengthening of the Hatch Act. On elections, a recognition, again, that opposition research is a thing of value, and therefore prohibited, the campaigns would be prohibited from receiving this thing of value from foreign sources. And enforcing that campaigns need to report foreign contacts to law enforcement. Now, none of that is going to go anywhere without a Democratic sweep in November. So what can we do now? Well, what can we do now? So one of the things I think we need to do is recognize that we are not in the run-up to a possible subversion of an election. we are observing the sabotaging of an election in real time. We are observing a president sabotage a national election in real time. So it's just talk. Well, it's not just talk. We are learning from the press that there are behind the scenes conspiracies, but there's a lot of very public talk, speeches, announcements, statements that that have the objective of undermining the public's confidence in the freedom and fairness of the election. The kinds of plots or subversion of the election after election day that seem to be in the works can't succeed unless widespread lack of confidence has been spread among the electorate. So these are not mere words. This is an active effort to lay the groundwork for post-election sabotage. So these efforts are working. A poll taken last month found that 60% of all respondents in the American public were very concerned or concerned about electoral fraud. And maybe most remarkably, 42% of Biden supporters think that they're worried, either concerned or very concerned that that the election is going to be fraudulent. So I think one thing we can do is recognize that this is real sabotage that's happening now. It's shocking, the fact that it's never happened before, and that those of us who are oldsters like me, who've lived through many elections, have never seen anything like this before, shouldn't lead us to think that it can't really be happening, because we've been here before with this president. And the fact that the sabotage is occurring in plain view and publicly should also not lead us to think, well, the guilelessness suggests that they can't really be plotting because it's public, it's in real view. But that's the point. The point is to sow uncertainty and insecurity about the elections. And what else can we do? Well, just the things that Professor McCoy mentioned: register to vote, make sure you have a plan to vote, you make sure you have a backup plan to vote, make sure everybody has a plan to vote and a backup plan to vote. So I'm sorry to be grim and grave, but I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. So we've had several questions come in. We also asked the professors who are teaching this class to get questions beforehand from students that Rob and I went through earlier this week. So the way that we thought we would run the rest of the panel is by letting those students who submitted their questions beforehand have a crack at getting some answers from some of our panelists. And then Rob and I will, I guess, switch off in posing the questions. If there is time, we'll be happy to try to address some of the questions in the queue. Also, we sort of selected respondents for the questions, but if any of the other panelists want to jump in and also answer one of the questions, that's fine as well. So I will start. We had our first question is from a student in my class, Olivia Gay at the University of Rochester. And basically she is asking about citizens' reactions, likely citizens' reactions, should there be a contested election. And so I'm paraphrasing her here, but she asks, how will each party's supporters act if their candidate loses and contests the election? Will they, meaning the citizens, support democracy? Will they protest? This is something that came up, I think, in almost everyone's remarks today. Or will they support even the use of violence to put their candidate in power? So I wanted to direct this question first to Sue, who's done a lot of work, particularly on turnout and protests, and ask her if she can at least begin the response to this kind of a question.
Thank you, Olivia. That's a great question. So, I hope that we have, a non-aftermath. I hope that we have political parties that, as was mentioned by the panelists, greet the disappointment, one or the other greets the disappointment of defeat graciously steps aside and decides to go on to fight another day. That's really important for democracy. It's true that they're almost can't. They're not worth their salt as competitive politicians if they don't smart a lot and maybe grind their teeth and have some stories to tell about how they were robbed of the election. But in a little bit of time, that what we count on is for the losing candidate to come around and say that the election was fair and we're going to go on and fight another day. Now, it doesn't feel that way, and it doesn't feel that way again for reasons that Professor McCoy mentioned. Both sides think that they are facing an existential threat, that our democracy and our society are at risk if their side doesn't win. And so I think it's quite predictable that there will be citizen reactions as well as lots of reactions that the political class engages in. I hope that the reactions that the protests that I expect that there will be peaceful. That's the key thing. Protests are a good thing for democracy when they're peaceful. They can demonstrate the intensity of feeling around an issue, which voting, elections don't. They can keep the, feet to the fire of politicians. I think we're seeing that in the racial reckoning protests in many cities these days. When protests get violent, as they already have, first of all, it's a PR disaster for the side that looks like it's being violent. We learned from the civil rights movement in the United States in the 1960s that the winning side, the side that brings over public opinion among the vast majority of people who won't be protesting, is the side that looks peaceful, that is peaceful. And if the other side is the one that engages in violence, that's going to be the losing side. So hopefully and that's a reason, by the way, that protest organizers and activists have one of their tasks is to keep discipline on their side. I think that just a final point, the sort of big, question mark hovering over this whole thing is COVID. It's a tough, so we think that people basically sort of weigh the benefits, the costs of participating against the costs of staying away, and that sort of that makes their decision on whether to go out and protest. It's really, so protests died down very dramatically in the first early months of 2020 with the pandemic, and then, so to my surprise, as someone who studied these things, came alight again. We're very, the cost of abstention, the cost of staying away, just overrode the cost of participation, which were sky high with COVID. Now we have seen that there haven't been so many super spreader events that seem to be linked to protests. They're out of doors. A lot of people are wearing masks, but it's a tough situation either way.
Okay, thank you, Sue. So our next question, this is coming from Maddie Savage, who is a student in my course, actually, at Brown. And this is directed at Rick, and it's kind of a long question, Rick, so stick with me here. And she has read—
Long as it's not multi-part.
It's I think it's one part, it's just long. And she's read your work, so, digging deep here. So she writes, in a February podcast about your book, Election Meltdown, you said that you can't have a democracy where people are not confident that votes have been fairly and accurately counted, where people think the results are somehow manipulated, where people don't believe in the legitimacy of the vote counting itself. The question is, knowing all of the controversy that has surrounded mail-in voting and the Postal Service the past few months, are you worried that this election could be classified as undemocratic if a significant portion of the population feels worried about the legitimacy of voting during the pandemic? Also, because so much has changed since the publishing of your book, do you feel as strongly about our ability to restore trust in our self-government in September of 2020?
Well, that's not as long as a typical faculty question, so that's okay. I think that things are marginally worse than I expected they would be when I wrote Election Meltdown, but aside from COVID, they're kind of going as I thought they would go. The signs were already there that we had these problems, and it was just a question of how things line up. I think I had a piece that I wrote think it was about 2 weeks ago, where I said that, this was published in the Washington Post, where I said that the best way for people to feel that the election is legitimate is to actually hold a legitimate election. I think it's important to draw this distinction, right? So there's what do people feel about the election, and there's the actuality of the election itself. If you run an unfair election, it's more likely that people are going to feel that it's illegitimate. So that means that, to take the example of the Postal Service, if we find out that ballots are being slow walked and not being delivered on time, and people are being disenfranchised, that will make people feel that the election's not fair because it's not fair. So we need to bracket out these two different concerns. One is, are people going to be, and this may go back to the answer to the last question, are people going to be out in the streets because things were actually unfair because we didn't have a fair election? And so I think that there's so much attention right now to everything that's going on. I think that helps to assure a fair election. We're demanding that election administrators be transparent. When it looked like the Postal Service was slow walking the ballots, there were congressional hearings, and there's a constant media attention. We have to keep that up. So the best assurance of the legitimacy among the largest part of the population is actually holding a legitimate election. Beyond that, it's important to knock down stories of fraud when they arise and are not supported by the evidence. As this today unfolding story about the press release that the Department of Justice issued. Just since we started this call, I see that the person who threw out those 9, or were they 7, Donald Trump ballots in that Pennsylvania county was a temporary worker who had been working for 3 days, who was reprimanded for making a mistake and fired. If that were the story as it was initially released, you wouldn't have anybody really believing the kind of claims like Trump said, that this shows widespread fraud. So I think being a watchdog and having information out there is going to help a lot. That said, I think especially if Trump loses the election, assuming it's a fair election, if Trump loses the election, there's going to be a good portion of his base that are going to follow his lead. And if he claims that he lost because the election is rigged, well, then they're going to believe that. Just like there's still I don't know what the percentage is, a good portion of Americans who believe that President Obama was not a legitimate president because he was born in Kenya and it's illegitimate. There's going to be some percentage. The question is whether it's more than just the hardcore people, at the fringes, and whether there's a general feeling that the election is illegitimate. If you go back and look at Bush versus Gore, there was a lot of anger on the Democratic side and lots of feeling that that election was not resolved fairly. But people moved on, and especially after 9/11, people accepted George W. Bush, and of course he was reelected as president. We can get beyond a crisis, but in order to do that, we have to start by holding an actually fair election, and we have to keep pushing to make sure. And it's not an on-off switch. There are going to be problems, that the election is as fair as we can possibly make it under these very difficult conditions.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to turn to Professor Hyde. I know you mentioned this in your comments, but we do have a question from 2 students at Williams College, Serena Canal and May Erzini Vernoy, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. And I'm just going to change their question slightly. They asked, should there be an international election monitoring of the US election? You, I believe, said there already has been international election monitoring. So I guess the question is, how could it have more of an effect, or how could it be seen as a more objective source of information, a more legitimate source of information for people?
That's a very good rephrasing of the question, and one that I'm not entirely sure I know the answer to. But I mean, one of the things that has long been a challenge for international observers in the US is, as Professor McCoy highlighted, the incredibly decentralized election administration of US elections, which makes it very difficult for them to even do their job as well as they are able to do their job in many other countries. So just to answer the question slightly more with slightly more detail, because many people seem to not be aware of this, following the 2000 elections, in which there was a lot of global controversy about them, not just within the United States, but many countries around the world were watching with interest what was happening in the US. The US and other European countries received a lot more pressure from other states within the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe to be less, I think one of the charges was to be less hypocritical and to have observers at their elections as well. And so since 2002, the US has invited, which is a condition of its membership in the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, has invited delegation of international observers from the OSCE ODIHR. They have conducted a needs assessment mission. A lot of things are more difficult right now for election observers because of the pandemic. But the recommendation from that needs assessment mission was that they send 100 long-term observers, 400 short-term observers, and conduct media monitoring, along with a number of other recommendations, but those were some of the high points of the recommendation. I think that one of the things that I think they could do, and that Jennifer, you may know about already and that may be ongoing, is to just work more closely with some of the bipartisan groups that have become active in the United States, or former US presidents, for example. Some of them have been getting in the mix in terms of talking about election quality and talking about this need for a really clear assessment of election quality. So I'm going to stop because I think Jennifer might actually be able to add something. I say this very sheepishly because Jennifer is the real expert on international election observation. She was the head of the mission on the very first mission that I ever went on when I was a lowly graduate student. I have learned a huge amount from her. So.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah, just to add, I completely agree that the main group that's been in the United States is the OSCE that Professor Hyde referenced. They write excellent reports. And so I would recommend that you Google just OSCE election observation report on US in the past. The problem is that it's up to each state to decide if they want to allow election observers. And so they can't cover all of the states. Georgia has restrictions, for example. And so that's one of the problems. And we're such a huge country that even, 400, if they're aiming for that, is small. And so what we usually said at the Carter Center was it's not only important to have international observers who are usually invited in because there's a deep distrust in the country, and they are to bring in impartial eyes to try to raise trust. And that's been what we've all been talking about today. But to get the numbers large enough are domestic observer organizations. So what Professor Hyde was referring to would be other NGOs who are nonpartisan, who are doing election observation, but they are Americans doing it. And sometimes it's called election protection, election monitoring. And then the political parties are allowed to have their own party poll watchers. That's different than a poll worker, who is the official worker, but poll watchers are political party representatives who can watch the process. So all of these things are important to increase transparency and get at what both Professor Hyde and Professor Hasen were talking about, in terms of transparency and knowing what really happened. And the last thing I want to say on that is every election I've monitored, there is on election day, conspiracy theories like wildfire floating around about some terrible thing that's happening. Almost always when we go to investigate, they're not accurate. They're easily debunked, but they're flying around. So when you hear about things that are happening on election day or election night or the day after, don't just automatically assume they're true. Wait and look at the information, wait for the investigation, and don't raise the level of suspicion even more than it needs to be. Then, if they are true and there needs to be protest about it, then go out and protest.
I want to pose a question. This is not for anyone in particular, so anyone can feel free to jump in. And this is a question from the students at Suffolk University. And I'm actually gonna attach to this a question that we got from the audience. So the question is, what poses a greater threat to election integrity, outside or domestic actors and institutions? For example, are foreign meddling misinformation or disinformation campaigns designed to manipulate voter behavior a greater threat than domestic actors doing the same thing or doing other things that would compromise the integrity of the vote. And just to give one example of a domestic type threat, and this comes from David Ennis, who is in the audience, he cited the example of partisans from one side or the other monitoring the election, but really just going to intimidate voters sort of in the name of election monitoring. So which of do you perceive these foreign or these domestic threats to be the greater threat in 2020?
That's a jump ball, so I'll say something. I don't think you can answer the question in the abstract. So I mentioned earlier that the Russians did 3 things in 2016. One was all of this hacking into voter registration databases, which didn't get a lot of attention, and they didn't change any votes. A second was they spent $100,000 on Facebook ads and other things trying to stir people up, but that was $100,000 out of about $4 billion spent in the election. That didn't seem like it had a big impact. But the leaking of the emails of John Podesta and others seemed to have a big impact on the election. So, it depends on what it is. If Trump actually organizes lots of people to go to polling places and intimidate voters, that could be a huge deal. I actually don't think that's going to happen. I think that's a lot of bluster. And it's actually a way of him raising funds and trying to discourage people from voting. But we saw in Virginia, I can't remember which other speaker mentioned it this week. We saw in Virginia a small Trump intimidating group near Fairfax County polling place. It got national coverage and condemnation, and I think if that stuff happens, it could really backfire. So I don't think we know what's more, but I wouldn't say the dividing line is between domestic and foreign, but it would have to do to the nature of the attempt to try to undermine the legitimacy of the election. For example, I talk about in this election meltdown, if there were a cyber attack on Detroit that cut the power in Detroit on election day, whether that was done by domestic or foreign actors, that would have tremendous impact on the outcome of the election if, say, Michigan were dispositive to the result. The source of it doesn't matter. It's the nature of how many people are affected and how it affects the votes that really matters.
Can I jump into,
yeah.
Unless anyone else indicated some other way that they want to talk. I think this is a really interesting question. And I think in a sort of comparative perspective, globally, I would say that for the most part, incumbent politicians and parties almost always have more ability to manipulate the process than any outside actor. And I know that's a gross generalization. I can't prove it, but it is my sense from looking at a lot of cases around the world. They often won't, and they don't, but just in terms of the scale of things. However, the main point, and I think this is kind of tied to other comments that have been made in this session, if an election is very close and it's very hotly contested, very small problems can make a big difference in terms of the outcome, especially in winner-take-all systems, like in the U.S. and especially the U.S. presidential election. So, in some ways, it doesn't matter which is the bigger problem if the election is super closely contested, and if very small problems can have can swing things one way or the other. And so I dislike both of them. I will end with that. Jennifer.
Yeah, Jennifer.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something we haven't really addressed yet, and that is the role of the courts, not just in the lawsuits that are coming about absentee ballots and stuff, which is huge, but the role of oversight. And so this intimidation thing actually came about because there was an injunction on the Republican Party going back more than 20 years where there was an attempt to actually intimidate voters with private off-duty sheriffs and officers, and sometimes bringing arms to provide protection around the polls, but that was seen as intimidating. So the Republican National Party was prohibited by the Justice Department from doing anything like that until this year. That has expired. And so that's why the fear of this. The other thing that has to do with the Justice Department, that is really critical for the level of trust and legitimacy that this election has in vote versus voter suppression is the Voting Rights Act that goes back to 1965, which was to redress decades of repression against African Americans from being able to vote, even after the 13th Amendment in 1870 gave the right for African American men, at least, to vote. And so the 1965 Voting Rights Act gave assurance that not only would they have the right to vote, but the Justice Department would have oversight over particularly the southern states where there had been these Jim Crow laws, the discrimination. That oversight lasted and was working to improve the ability of African Americans to vote. And then they added other language minority people to it. So also to make sure that information was provided in other minority languages, non-English languages, until 2013 in a Supreme Court decision that basically gutted that. So that no longer occurs. And so the fear is, actually it's not just fear, there's actually evidence of attempts to, again, gerrymander or do other kinds of things like creating at-large positions to dilute the vote of African Americans and sometimes other minorities. So this is something that we have to continue to watch. So there was federal oversight. Congress voted almost unanimously in 2006 to extend that oversight for 25 years, but a lawsuit in 2013 from Alabama made it to the Supreme Court. And that oversight was then gutted. So this is another concern. I just wanted to make sure we put that on the table.
I know you have other questions you want to get to, but I just want to jump in really quick on this. So Professor Hasen made in passing a very important point, which is that there's sort of actions and reactions on voting. The research on the effect of voter ID laws, which have come in largely after the court decision that Professor McCoy was just mentioning, the research suggests that they haven't had much of an effect. They haven't had as much of an effect in, say, suppressing the African American vote as was feared or maybe hoped for in some quarters. And the reason seems to be that they are also a great mobilizing device. So, if your group is the object of legal efforts to keep you away from the polls, that's a great opportunity for the other party to come along and say, do we want that to happen? And so they're really mixed. This is not to say that erecting barriers to voting is a good thing, and over the long term, there might be certainly sort of suppression effects. But if you vote in the United States, you're tough. Voting in this country is not for sissies. And we saw in the primary, for example, in Wisconsin, people they went out in rotten weather with a pandemic raging and with very few polling places, and they waited hours and hours and hours. And so the efforts at suppressing voter turnout are a mixed bag.
So I just want to jump in here. I think you guys have taken the conversation in exactly the direction that Rob and I were hoping it would go in. We have a number of questions coming in from students, basically about how voting ID laws sort of interact with problems of disenfranchising minority voters in the United States. I know in our class, we just read the new Mettler and Lieberman book that has an excellent chapter on the disenfranchisement of African Americans in the South post-Reconstruction. And I think we're seeing similar efforts to disenfranchise minority voters that have been going on for several years now in the United States. So let me tie this to a specific question that we got from one of the students, Reshi Rajan at Georgia. They say in many states in the United States, there's been an increase in voter verification laws and a tightening of registration laws. Is this a new phenomenon in countries around the world, or has this method of voter disenfranchisement been seen historically And if so, can it be correlated with the health of a democracy? Anyone want to jump in and take that?
Can I just reference something Jennifer already said, which is that in most countries of the world, election administration is so different that they're able to have a centralized process to provide access to everyone in the country. And it's not controversial in the same way in most countries around the world. That said, there's a lot of efforts around the world to manipulate the voter register, but it's typically not through voter identification. So we can go through lots of different examples. There's some strange cases. For example, they can do selective enforcement of some sort of obscure requirements for voter identification, which I have heard of, but doesn't seem to be widespread. But the thing that is weird about the US is this lack of national identity card, like Jennifer mentioned. So one of the elections that I observed very early on in my experience with election observation was in Indonesia. And they managed in Indonesia, a country with 11,000 islands, I believe more voters than the United States, and 60% of the population that speaks the language that most of the business of Indonesian government is conducted in. They managed to get everyone in that country a voter identification card, at least at that time. The process has since had some troubles, but it's not like a logistical impossibility to make voting accessible to all persons. It has been so corrupted in the US, and the notion that voter identification laws in the United States are about fraud is, to me, kind of laughable, right? It's so clear from so many misstatements over and over again that this is a deliberate effort to disenfranchise certain very specific groups of voters in some states around the world, and so, or some states in the country. And so it's almost a very US problem. I'll let other people talk more about the specific problem in the US, but I've just had that. I wanted to emphasize what Jennifer was already.
I was going to point out that I was on the, and maybe Rick was too, I don't remember, on the academic advisory committee for a federal commission that was set up after the 2000 debacle of the election. It was run by President Carter and Jim Baker. And so it was a bipartisan commission. And we discussed and actually recommended a national ID card to overcome this problem. But we know that the United States, we are a country of such extreme individual freedom loving, we're on the extreme of protecting individual freedoms and not wanting big government, basically, or centralized information like that it's very hard to get through. So the recommendation was not in order to make voting more difficult, but to make it easier instead of having all these different requirements from different states. But because wasn't going to go through and be made easy, and also automatic registration like most other countries have, then instead the state started taking it individually and implementing these very strict laws, which do make it harder for poorer people, more rural people, younger people who move around a lot, and usually minorities to get the right IDs to vote.
Yeah, just back to the other point of that question. Some people call this the new Jim Crow. It's a lot like the old Jim Crow. It attempts to make people, especially people of color, to make them jump through hoops before they can vote. And just because a voter ID law, as others have said, doesn't have a big effect, that's because people are having to put tremendous energy into overcoming the effects of those laws, what they could have otherwise put into getting out the vote. In fact, I just did a panel with Yasmin Dawood of the University of Toronto and Graham Orr of an Australian university in Brisbane on comparative election administration. And we're the only advanced democracy that doesn't have a national nonpartisan body administering elections with a national voter identification system. So we're just so much of an outlier that, the other countries look at us and they can't believe this is how we run our election with 10,500 different election jurisdictions running with their own rules and without uniformity, and with the ability to make it harder in some places for people to register and vote. And the courts have not played enough of a backstop role, in my view, at all in preventing laws that serve no legitimate purpose in preventing fraud or promoting voter confidence, but instead seem like efforts, whether they're successful or not, to make it harder for at least some people to register and to vote.
Okay, so we have about 5 minutes left and about 20 questions. So I'm just going to pick one that actually it arose a number of times from the students, and we're also seeing it in the Q&A from the attendees. So I think it's of particular interest, and it's about social media. So let me first ask the question. This actually this is from Professor McCoy's students at Georgia State. The question is, what is the influence of social media on voting, and what responsibility do social media companies have for correcting misinformation? And then from Tommy Whiteley from my class at Brown, he puts a spin on this, asking, do you think that technology companies should be compelled to censor the distribution of misinformation on their platforms? So I'll pose that to anyone who wants to pick up the baton, and we'll take about 4 minutes to answer this last question. Rick, I think you're muted.
I'm muted, of course. It wouldn't be a Zoom event unless somebody's tried to speak when they were muted. I'm writing my current book project is called Cheap Speech, and it's on this very topic. So in a year and a half, we can come back. But and I can tell you what I really think. But my first cut is that I think it would be legal for the government to require social media companies to remove objectively false information about where, when, and how to vote. For example, telling people that you can vote by text. I think you could make it a law to remove that kind of misinformation. But there are lots of things that are misleading or that are predictions, like we're going to have fraud in the election, that wouldn't fall under this category. And therefore, it's very hard to figure out how to draw lines. It's also unclear how much this misinformation actually affects actual elections. Certainly gets people riled up. But I think the social science is very uncertain as to how much effect these things actually have.
Okay, I'm going to be stronger than Rick, because I think our democracy is being very much harmed by the misinformation and the disinformation on social media, and democracies around the world, countries around the world, where this level of information is not only harming democracies and elections, interfering in elections, but actually creating genocide. So I'm very concerned about it. Now, how to deal with it, though, yeah, I agree with Professor Hasen that, we've got all of our principles of free speech, but our election authority, again, we do have one thing, which is the Federal Election Commission, which is only charged with looking at campaign finance. So it has much weaker authority than any other country in the world, election authority, who most other countries will be able to regulate political advertising, the campaign advertising, at least. And so ours could, certainly we can regulate what Professor Hasen said, misinformation about the voting process. That would be legal. But also political advertising, the private companies, Facebook, Twitter, the others, can make their own decision about whether or not to accept political advertising, much less regulating it. If they don't want to regulate it, if they're worried about assessing whether something is false or not, or don't want to play that role, they could decide not to even take political ads, as Twitter did. And so I would favor a stronger approach to this, because I think overall it's a real harm to our democracy. I don't have the specific formula, though.
Okay, I don't know if Susan or Sue, do you want to have a last word on that, or you?
Huge problem. I'll say that it's a huge problem.
Yeah, and it's good to hear from Professor Hasen that there may be legal room for greater controls. Mark Zuckerberg, if you're listening, I don't think they want to look back. If one of these nightmare scenarios plays out that we're now worried about and that we're reading about in our major press, and it's facilitated by a big swath of the electorate thinking that the Democratic Party is involved in a major, because that's what Trump is saying, right? He's saying the Democrats know about this. They know all about it. So he's implying that this is a plot by the Democratic Party to steal the election. And if we have violence and chaos, and we have any of the other kind of nightmare scenarios that are being thought through right now, does the social media want to look back and say, we should have done more to stop that from happening? So, my two bits.
Okay, all right. So we're going to close it there. So on behalf of Gretchen and myself and the hundreds of students and other attendees that I know have been listening for the past hour and a half, I want to extend an enormous thank you to our panelists, Professors McCoy, Hyde, Stokes, and Hasen. This has been incredibly thoughtful and incredibly thought-provoking. I think my blood pressure is considerably higher now than it was at 3 o'clock. So hopefully it'll lower as the evening goes on. But I will certainly have a lot to reflect on, and I know our students certainly will as well. So thank you very much. I also want to say we received a number of more sort of technical questions from students about how to register to vote or different sorts of rules about registering to vote. So I'm going to ask, just as our final slide here, if Paul or Kyle from Brown could put up, yes, there it is. So this is information that you can use. It's sort of general information. There's a lot more out there. I think, as Professor McCoy said earlier, and as our other panelists echoed, the key is to make a plan to vote. And we actually do have social science research showing that people who make a plan to vote are much more likely to vote. And make a plan, make a plan with friends, with family. If you are unsure about how to register or what the rules are in your state, these are a couple of really great resources, Turbo Vote, and then for students in particular, Campus Vote Project. Please do check out those resources. There is a lot of information out there that is going to help you navigate this very tricky and very unusual election season. So with that, I'm going to close. Thank you again so much to our panelists. Thank you to all of you who joined us, both our students and others coming from all over the country. This has been an incredible event, and we'll look forward to November 3rd.
Thanks, Rob and Gretchen. Appreciate it.